it can become anti-Semitism. And I think it becomes anti-Semitic when, like you said, when, Jews collectively are blamed for Israel's actions, or when, Israel is held to a completely different standard than every other country.
What are the arguments against or arguments that disprove that claim of genocide?
You have to prove intent to destroy a people group. What is life actually like in Gaza right now for the people who are there?
There's massive corruption of the humanitarian aid that is trying to act as some sort of stopgap measure. There are, in the last couple of weeks, reports coming out. Either Hamas fighters or individuals who run NGOs have begun to exploit vulnerable women, especially widows, either of civilians killed or even of Hamas fighters killed, in exchange for humanitarian aid and food.
Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Passages Pulse. My name is Josiah McGee, back here with Olivia Lane. Today is Tuesday, May 19, 2026. Last week, we had what I thought was a fantastic live conversation and Ask Us Anything episode with some of our listeners. Thank you to those who participated. And unfortunately, we did not have time to get to every question that we received, either in writing ahead of that episode or during the conversation, especially a couple of questions we got about Gaza. So we're going to be talking about that this week. I will say it's been a while since we've talked about Gaza. It does happen to be back in the news recently. So it feels like a fitting time for us to take a trip back there and have a conversation about what's going on. So Olivia, anything you want to say before we get started, or should we just jump in?
Yeah, the only thing I'll say is I thought it was awesome how the Q&A session went, and I really am excited to do more of that. So if you're listening and you were there for that, thanks for chiming in and being there. I know Josiah and I had a really great time, and it'll be super cool to keep doing in the future.
Yes, I learned that I'm an influencer, which was rather shocking, but was a fun revelation. So we all learned something last week. It was a good time. All right, let's get into some of the questions that we had not the chance to get to last week. We do want to make sure that we're getting to as far as the situation in Gaza. This question, I think, is a good one. And really, we've been hearing this almost since the start of the war, post October 7. We keep hearing about Israel's genocide in Gaza, quote unquote. What are the arguments against or arguments that disprove that claim of genocide? Olivia, do you want to take first crack at this?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I know you know this, Josiah, but I'm currently getting my master's in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and I started that whole process before October 7th and, the following war. So when I've been, as I've been going through the program, this has been a main topic of conversation for a lot of people, and it's been so interesting to actually study it as a sort of legal term in an academic setting, and then go online and see a lot of people use this term in a very different context. And so as I've sort of been thinking about this on my own, I've really been thinking about what the elements of genocide are from a legal perspective, because the term genocide is a legal term first and foremost. And I would say, based off of what I've done, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this too, the strongest argument is that genocide requires intent. Pretty much anybody who's familiar with court of law, intent is one of the most difficult things to prove. You have to prove intent to destroy a people group, and Israel's obviously stated military objective has consistently been specifically the destruction of Hamas after October 7th, not the quote-unquote extermination of Palestinians as an ethnic group. And I think that's something really big to notice off the bat. And while obviously there are, fringe members of the Knesset, of the Israeli government, who have said outrageous things, they are widely condemned by other members of government, and they are no way representative of the Israeli government as a whole. Not only that factor of intent, but also Israel has taken measures that no other country has ever been expected to take when it comes to war. That includes things like evacuation warnings via text message, phone calls, leaflets, humanitarian corridors, temporary pauses in fighting, and coordination of aid delivered to Gaza, even when fighting an enemy that is intentionally embedding themselves into civilian areas, which obviously adds a whole nother level of complexity to the whole situation. And so the thing that I keep coming back to is no country that would be intent on committing a genocide would be willing to put their own soldiers' lives in danger in order to actually protect the lives of this said people that they're attempting to commit a genocide against. when you look at it from that perspective, it really just makes no sense. And obviously, it's worth noting, and you and I have said this, multiple times, that civilian casualties in Gaza are tragic and they are significant, but high civilian death tolls does not legally equal genocide. Urban warfare against groups operating from dense civilian infrastructure has historically produced devastating civilian casualty rates in conflicts like Iraq, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and obviously, and I'm sure we'll get into this, and we've talked about this before too, but the statistics, the civilian to combatant ratio, and the death toll numbers have added a whole other level of complexity here because the Gaza Ministry of Health is run by Hamas. And if you take the IDF numbers and what they're purporting to be, what are the most commonly referenced, use those numbers and compare them to the Gaza Ministry of Health numbers, it appears that the civilian to combatant ratio is actually technically pretty low, especially in comparison to other wars fought in dense urban combat. So obviously compassion is good and appropriate and necessary, but so is logic and critical thinking and being clear-eyed about throwing around a term like genocide.
No, I think what you're saying makes sense. I think the first thing that comes to mind when you hear this term genocide thrown around is you really have to take a step back and ask yourself, okay, in what context is this term being used? It's not the same context in which the term was invented. So do people really understand what the term means? You have a term that essentially was invented. You can correct me if I'm wrong, given your studies, Olivia, but from what I've read and what I understand, there wasn't a word for the crime of genocide until after the Holocaust. It was during the process of prosecuting the crimes that took place during World War II, especially the Holocaust, that they had to invent a new term, add new vocabulary. They could effectively describe the scope of the crimes that were committed, the nature of the evil that was previously unimaginable or very, very difficult to imagine. And unfortunately, we still see that happening even today. There was a report that came out, the Civil Commission in Israel, on various crimes of, particularly of a sexual nature, committed by Hamas on October 7. Some of the things that took place on that day were so horrific and previously unimaginable that there just was no category to describe them, that they're again having to invent new terms to sort of describe what actually happened on October 7. Genocide is a good example of this, or the crime of forcing family members to commit acts of sexual violence with each other or to each other, or forcing family members to watch as these things happen. I say all that to say, when someone throws around a term like genocide, it's a term that is often reached for because we don't have better vocabulary, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people understand what the term actually means or what the definition of the term is. And the reason why terms like this are often misapplied is because we, living our daily lives, are generally not confronted with the level of evil or the type of crimes that we're trying to find terminology for, which leads to, in many cases, unfortunately, overreaching to try to sort of wrap our mind around how do we think about the nature of violence. To your point as well, I think it's also really important that we have a conversation about balancing and I've said this time and time again at different events or maybe even on this podcast, the importance of balancing the two sides of our humanity. There's the compassionate side of who we are. There's the rational side of who we are, the ability to think critically. And typically what happens when you're confronted with a problem that you're not familiar with or you don't necessarily know how to solve, is you're going to gravitate to one or the other because you maybe don't understand how to balance or maybe even lack the capacity to balance both of those aspects, the compassionate side and the rational critical thinking side. And to give a couple of examples of what this looks like, I think one of the things that happens all the time is people will immediately jump to genocide because they see something that is horrific, large numbers of casualties, and they assume, well, this must be mass murder, essentially. They don't necessarily think about the critical thinking aspect. How do we know that this is something that actually rises to the level of murder and not simply a tragedy that is evil in nature and that death is always bad, but doesn't necessarily rise to the level of a crime or a murder. If you think about putting on our legal hat for a moment, so you laid out a couple of important points as well, but I think one recent story that I was reading, which also illustrates the complexity of this or the problems associated, is that the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has declined essentially to bring any charges. He was interviewed in The Hague recently about the lack of genocide charges brought against any Israeli political or military officials. And for context, I will say he has brought indictments against a number of Israeli officials on other issues, which often have been alleged to be politically motivated or lacking a strong case. But he's never brought genocide charges against an Israeli official. And when he was pressed on this point during the interview, he said that legal cases, have to follow the evidence. If he had the evidence, he would have brought a case, but he hasn't. What he's saying essentially is there's just no evidence, legal evidence, that Israel has actually committed or intended to commit a genocide against the Palestinians. That's pretty significant. And if you're able to set aside for a moment the emotional weight of this issue and think very critically, if a prosecutor who rarely misses an opportunity to indict Israeli officials for various crimes that he thinks they may or may not have committed is refusing to indict them on charges of genocide because he doesn't have the evidence to do so. On the flip side of that, if you're thinking about this in compassionate terms, I think we have to be able to reconcile what you brought up, Olivia, good points about the numbers and what the data tells us, the actual outcomes of the war, and all of that. If you only focus on those things and you feel nothing about what's happening to Palestinians, well, okay, we do have a problem in reverse. We kind of have the opposite problem, and we have to figure out how to bring compassion back into the conversation. Christians, I think, should feel something. Now, the hard part in finding the balance is deciding what you do with that compassion and those strong feelings of sympathy. What I think is that they can be channeled for a lot of good, but only if you're intentional about how you're harnessing those feelings of sympathy and compassion. Ideally, in a perfect world, what those senses would do, that sense of compassion would drive Christians to do, is try to find the truth and think critically, motivate us to think critically, to try to find real solutions to the problems. I think we should be having very real, frank conversations about how Palestinians will continue to suffer if Hamas stays in power in Gaza. And that's regardless of whether Israel is at war with Hamas or not. I mean, they will continue to suffer under Hamas rule. We should be realistic as well. I brought this point up to someone recently that if Christians want to play a role in the conversation as advocates for Palestinians as they are suffering, then accusing Israel of something that certainly does not appear to be remotely true, that it has committed a genocide, is a good way to be excluded from the conversation. It's not going to earn you any friends in Israel. No one in Israel is going to hear you accuse them of genocide and say, you know what, that's an interesting point. Why don't you help us figure out what to do about it? They're going to say, that's ridiculous. We have not committed the genocide, and they're not going to give you a seat at the table to have a conversation about how to alleviate Palestinian suffering. If you want to have a seat at that table, to be a part of the answer to these problems, then I think Christians need to be intentional about how we balance these tensions between feeling compassion and thinking critically about what's actually going on in Gaza. So I've said a lot. Olivia, thank you for what you had to say on this subject. But there was another question regarding the concept of flotillas. If you're not familiar, Olivia is about to explain this to you. Could you please give us a quick background on what these flotillas are that are trying to reach Gaza? And then we'll talk a bit about what happened yesterday with the latest attempt.
Flotillas. Okay, so if you haven't already heard about it, the concept of flotillas are not an abnormal thing. They've become a lot more popular, especially since the war in Gaza started. And basically what it is that periodically a group of people from around the world, often organized by either like a European or a Turkish NGO, will try to break Israel's naval blockade of the Gaza Strip. And usually these groups will claim to be transporting humanitarian aid, and Israel will then ask them, hey, like why not just like send that aid through certain approved channels? And then the flotilla participants will refuse, and then Israel will board that ship as they attempt to block and like get through a naval blockade. The Israeli Navy will then escort these people safely to shore, and then they will deport everybody involved back to their countries of origin. And usually these are, non-violent. Oftentimes also the aid that is involved is typically like symbolic. So I think on like the last, not this most recent one, but the one before that Greta Thunberg was on, I think they had like one box of aid or something like that. And in this most recent one, I think I saw a clip somewhere of them like throwing candy into the ocean or something so that it would reach the shore, I think was their goal there. But typically it's non-violent. However, there was one extreme case, at least that I know of a few years ago, where a Turkish flotilla decided to fight back against the Israeli Navy that boarded the ship, and several people were killed during that process. Usually, however, the process is relatively peaceful. And another Turkish led flotilla, the most recent one that we'll be talking about today, tried to reach Gaza yesterday with about 500 people from 45 different countries. So, yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Josiah. Also, I have a lot of people that are in my DMs asking me, like, why doesn't Israel just let them dock in Gaza? Like, if that's what they want to do, why not just let
Yeah.
them do that? I would love to hear your thoughts on that one.
Yeah. Well, the people in your DMs, I think, are actually a little bit more gracious in the way that they ask that question, because what I'm seeing online is more so accusations that Israel's committed some kind of war crime by boarding these ships and escorting them ashore and deporting the individuals involved. Actually, there's a video yesterday that I thought was rather amusing. I don't know if you saw this, Olivia, but apparently one of the ships being boarded, there was a very white dude who was making this video and complaining that he had been subjected to a war crime because apparently the Israeli naval boats that had come alongside was blasting at a very high volume some Britney Spears music,
Mm-hmm.
which was just funny. Apparently, it was interfering with his ability to talk on the radio to other boats, whatever he couldn't hear because the Britney Spears music was so loud, and this is a war crime. And it's just kind of silly, honestly, that accusation that something
It feels
like
like an
that would be
SNL
considered a war
skit.
crime. It does a little bit. It does a little bit, but I think I appreciate people who are asking a sincere question about what's actually the problem here. I mean,
Yeah.
if you look at the behavior of a lot of the activists on these flotillas, and that's really what they are. They're not humanitarian workers. They're activists who are making social media videos and treating this as one massive protest, essentially. A lot of their behavior seems to be pretty silly. So is it really hurting anything? I mean, are they really going to hurt Israel or harm anyone by engaging in these PR stunts that are really just that? They're PR stunts, and it seems harmless. And the answer from Israel's perspective, at least, is that yes, there is actually some potential harm that could be done. And the reasons why they don't allow them to dock and instead sort of escort them away are, number one, there is an active naval blockade of the Gaza Strip, meaning that nothing is allowed in or out through the sea, only through approved channels that involve an inspection routine over land routes. Because Hamas in the past would be smuggling things in and out through different checkpoints or locations that had dual purpose, could be used both for humanitarian purposes or for military purposes like building tunnels or producing weapons. So any attempt to break that blockade is essentially going to have an adverse effect on Israel's ability to enforce the blockade, which is designed to deny Hamas certain materials. You're also going to be putting civilians in a position where they're entering a closed military zone. That's really not a good idea. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that could even accidentally go wrong. And
Mhm.
then if something accidentally were to happen, someone accidentally gets hurt, then all of a sudden Israel has an even bigger crisis on its hands because it's not like they were intending to harm these individuals, but they got in the way during some military exercises or whatever, and now you have a problem. It's the same reason why you don't allow people to just drive across a shooting range when live fire drills are being done, because you can't allow someone to be downrange of a shooting exercise. They might get hurt. Same concept. So Israel does have reasons why they don't allow people into those waters. I think if you take a step back and think more high level, why does the blockade exist in the first place? I mean, that's I think a valid question. Is the blockade itself a good thing? If the point of denying these ships is to protect the blockade, well, it begs the question: is the blockade itself good and necessary? And I think the argument that Israel would make is yes, it is. Not only because they're trying to deny Hamas certain materials, which can be used in very bad ways, but also because symbolically it matters. The real impact of these activists reaching Gaza would not be really to change any humanitarian outcomes, because to your point, Olivia, they don't really carry much humanitarian aid with them. These are relatively small sailboats in most cases that are sailing from Cyprus or wherever. The real outcome would be to weaken Hamas's isolation, because Israel's strategy post October 7 has been not just to gradually force Hamas out of control of the Gaza Strip, or out of power in the Gaza Strip by disarming it or choking off its supply routes, but also by removing its ability to control or to extort the civilian population of the Gaza Strip and to isolate it in the international community so that it can't rely on other people to help it survive as a terrorist organization. If you destroy the blockade, then I mean that's tough. You've just given Hamas legitimacy in the eyes of the international community. It's a victim. It's not a terrorist organization. And the truth of the story is that it really is a terrorist organization. You've just given it the ability to smuggle in additional materials that they shouldn't have. You've also given them more ammunition, figuratively speaking, to control the civilian population of Gaza by controlling their access to supplies and humanitarian routes. And it's just a bad idea in general to give Hamas that kind of leverage or ability to outlast the Israeli offensive against it. So I think that's the reasons why. Again, it's kind of hard when all you see is a video of some commandos boarding a sailboat and putting people back in the gunboat and saying, okay, we're going to go back to shore and you'll be deported in a few minutes. If that's all you really see, if that's all you know about the situation, then yes, I get it. That kind of looks bad. But there's a much bigger story to the blockade of Gaza and reasons why it exists that I think are important context.
Yeah, I think too, I don't know, maybe you feel the same way, but I think it's interesting how the topic of Gaza, I feel like has kind of, I don't know, recently been, I feel like a little bit on the back burner. I think since the hostages have been out of Gaza, I feel like I haven't really heard that much about like the progress being made on the ground or anything like that. So I would love to
Yeah.
know from you, what is life actually like in Gaza right now for the people who are there?
Very poor for a few reasons. And I think it's important to avoid sugarcoating it, make it sound better than it is, because it's very, very bad. Basically, what happened is in October of last year, there was an agreement reached for a ceasefire in exchange for all the hostages back. Part of the arrangement for that ceasefire was that there would be a long-term plans to disarm Hamas and reconstruct Gaza. Hamas, of course, immediately after the deal went into effect, started to basically argue, the details are a little bit fuzzy. We didn't actually agree to disarm, or we might disarm but reconstitute ourselves in some other fashion under a new name or something, and basically made it very clear that they had no intention of living up to most of the obligations under the ceasefire, except the obligation to release the hostages, which, thank goodness, they did actually do last fall. So what you have now, months later, there's the whole Board of Peace and this peace plan, commissioners who are trying to sort out how to implement the terms of this deal, the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas that is more or less guaranteed by the United States and this International Board of Peace. And they're having a very hard time pushing the plan forward. I mean, there's really been very little progress made in actually executing some of the mid to long-term objectives of that ceasefire. It requires Hamas to disarm, but it refuses to do so. It continues to fight the IDF in Gaza and maintain its arms, its weapons to also suppress opposition among the Palestinians. You have cases in which Hamas is immediately after the ceasefire, and all these reports that they were torturing dissidents or people who had criticized Hamas during the war, and they hadn't been able to suppress that sort of criticism or opposition from Palestinians during the war because they were hiding underground in their tunnels. As soon as the war ended, they came out of the woodworks and started to terrorize Palestinians, not just Israelis. And they continue to do that even today. I mean, that hasn't really changed. It's a pretty dangerous situation for many Palestinians. It's even threatened or attacked Palestinians who are trying to participate or get jobs in the reconstruction efforts. There was headlines about this just last week. And as long as that's the case, the international community, especially some of the wealthy countries like the UAE, for example, that had pledged money towards reconstruction, they don't want to actually give that money to finance large-scale reconstruction because the concern is that Hamas will sabotage those projects, or that if it refuses to disarm, eventually there will be another war between Hamas and Israel because it will once again try to commit terror attacks. And some of the projects, even after completion, might eventually be destroyed and have to be rebuilt again. This vicious cycle doesn't end until Hamas is out of the picture. These countries know this, and they don't want to spend money on something that might just be a terrible waste. So it's been very, very challenging to make progress on the process of helping Gaza recover from the war. International attention has also, I think, been focused a lot on Iran, obviously not in Gaza for the last few months. So understandably so, people are kind of now, as the war in Iran appears to be winding down. Maybe not. It's been at pause, at least for several weeks. Only in the last several weeks has attention turned back to Gaza, and people are realizing it's still pretty messed up there, and nothing's really gotten better yet. The outcome of this delay, these pauses, these attempts at sabotage is ongoing economic shortages. It's very, very bad. Access to basic supplies, inflation, the cost of supplies, food, still very high. The gaps in healthcare, public healthcare, are significant because of the effects of the war on supply routes or different facilities. Hospitals that Hamas was using as bases of operation during the war still need to be put back into operation or made fully operational again, because they may be operating at a reduced capacity right now. There are very poor living conditions. I mean, there's really been no reconstruction of large housing projects yet, which is, a big problem. And there's massive corruption of the humanitarian aid that is trying to act as some sort of stopgap measure. There are, in the last couple of weeks, reports coming out which have not been reported very much in American press, which I find interesting, but in British press or in some smaller independent media outlets in the Middle East, reports that there are very credible testimonies from Palestinian dissidents, either Hamas fighters or individuals who run NGOs which are somehow affiliated with or cooperating with Hamas, have begun to exploit vulnerable women, especially widows either of civilians killed or even of Hamas fighters killed, in exchange for humanitarian aid and food. And to be very blunt about what we're talking about sexual exploitation, forced marriages, or sexual harassment, or rape, or whatever it may be, in exchange for food and humanitarian aid. The level of corruption that illustrates is just obscene, and it's really hard to wrap your mind around. But when you put all those pieces together, what you get is a picture in Gaza that remains very, very bleak, unfortunately.
Wow.
Does that answer your question, Olivia?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, that's really, I think it's also important to acknowledge that too, that Hamas is committing these atrocities, and that it's so unfortunate. And I think that it's a shame that kind of exploitation especially has not been something that has really hit Western headlines at all, from what I'm seeing, which was a great point that you made. I haven't seen that article really honestly anywhere in the mainstream media. So I'm glad that we're talking about that. And I think it's also important because, we're talking about these sort of systems in place that, a lot of people have different opinions on and thoughts about. And I know we get this question from a lot of different people, and from people who are interested in Israel in general, which is the question that I'd love to hear your thoughts on, which is like, is it anti-Semitic to criticize the Israeli government? Is it anti-Semitic to criticize, maybe policy and still support the Jewish people? And I would love to hear your thoughts on that, because especially while we're talking about this, there's so much here. And I think that question ends up, while we're having these other conversations, at some point that gets brought up. And so I would love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question. I think before we segue to that, I do want to clarify that a lot of what we've described is the fault of Hamas. It is, of course, necessary and appropriate. We get questions like this all the time about, is it ever appropriate to criticize Israel? The answer is yes. I'll explain why in a moment. But I don't want to give the impression that means that we're creating a sense of moral equivalency between Hamas and Israel. The things that we are criticizing Hamas for are very different from the things that we're criticizing Israel for, in terms of the type of things that they do, the severity of them, the scale. I mean, it's a very totally different situation that we're addressing when you criticize Hamas versus criticizing Israel. Now, on the flip side of that, it is, of course, I think, important to acknowledge that, yes, at times it is possible, even necessary, to criticize Israel. It is not above critique, and you can do that without being anti-Semitic, something I think is often very confusing to a lot of Christians, non-Jewish people, who are trying to read between the lines and find that very fine line between criticizing Israel and saying something that is accidentally anti-Semitic. I hear this concern a lot. And the way I think about it, at least, is that anti-Semitism occurs when you overgeneralize Israel's actions or the character of its citizens, or discriminate against Israel and its citizens simply because they are Jewish. If you're going to engage in constructive criticism of Israel, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's anti-Semitic, particularly if you can articulate a concern with a specific individual or policy that is not casting blame or shame against the society as a whole. And if it is based on an individual's actions, not based on some stereotype or an assumption that their character is fundamentally flawed simply because they're Jewish, that's anti-Semitic. I mean, there's really no way of explaining your way out of that one. That's an anti-Semitic thing to say. But if you can explain why you have a problem with their behavior based on a specific action and the morality or lack thereof of that choice, that's not anti-Semitic. And I think Christians can, and frankly, I think we should have the ability to respectfully but directly say what we think on certain issues that have moral consequences. Olivia, what would you say to that question?
Yeah, I love the way you put that. I think just adding on to what you've said, obviously people criticize governments around the world all the time, including allies, which Israel is of the United States. I actually, as you were talking, I was thinking of how Charlie Kirk has said a few times that he criticizes some things in the United States because he loves the United States so much. And so I don't think that if you have a critique of something or even maybe a concern of something, that doesn't mean that you hate something or that it makes you anti-Semitic because you hate something that a country does. There are a lot of things that I don't like the United States does, but I'm one of the most patriotic people I know. So I don't think that it's fair to say that if you have a critique of the Israeli government or a policy that you're therefore anti-Semitic. It can become anti-Semitism. And I think it becomes anti-Semitic when, like you said, when, Jews collectively are blamed for Israel's actions, or when, Israel is held to a completely different standard than every other country, or when classic anti-Semitic stereotypes are used. And I think one of the most common ones that I've seen, even with the genocide claim in some circumstances, that can very easily become a blood libel. And that is when I would argue that then becomes anti-Semitic. If in your mind Jews are just bloodthirsty and they're just wantonly killing Palestinians because they can, that no longer, in my opinion, is a sort of justifiable critique of Israeli policy. That begins to border on just classic anti-Semitic tropes. And so obviously, being somebody who now lives in Israel, many Israelis themselves strongly have opinions about their own government and condemn and criticize their own government and policies. So obviously, that is a totally fine thing to do, to have opinions, and you can absolutely support the Jewish people while disagreeing with certain Israeli policies. I think that's a completely normal and legitimate position to take.
Yep, I agree. I think these are good questions. I'm glad people are asking these questions and sending them in, because it's honestly the kind of questions that I am talking about with people at church, or people will text with questions. I'm not on social media very much, but Olivia, you are. So your DMs, I know you're getting questions like these. I think it's good, I think, to really talk about the stuff that is top of mind for a lot of people right now. Appreciate your willingness to do that, Olivia. Appreciate our listeners for flagging these questions for us, bringing them to our attention. I hope that we can have more good conversations like this. Before we go, I just want to also thank Lindsay for, as always, producing these episodes, being our support on the back end. We appreciate you a lot, Lindsay. Thank you very much for everything that you do. And we look forward to seeing everyone back here next week.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Passages seeks to prepare and empower a new generation of Christian leaders who love God, stand with the Jewish people, and support Israel. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit www.passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep you connected to the Pulse.